A Werewolf Shifter Romance, written by Amelia Hart. Chapter 1. What the Barn Held. The farm had always felt like a prison, though Isabel Hartford had never consciously chosen to admit that to herself. 26 years of breathing the same humid Pennsylvania air, walking the same worn paths between house and field, watching the seasons shift from her perspective on the porch, while her father aged in a way that seemed both inevitable and unfair. Her mother's death had crystallized something in Thomas Hartford, a fear so profound it had calcified into control. He couldn't lose anyone else, so he held Isabel close, not through cruelty, but through a suffocating kind of care that made her feel simultaneously cherished and trapped. The evening air was thick with the approaching autumn as she made her way toward the massive red barn that anchored the eastern edge of their property. Her boots crunched against the gravel path, a sound so familiar it barely registered anymore. Nightly verification of the animals had become ritual, something to do when the house felt too small, when Thomas's quiet presence in the living room seemed to press against her chest like a hand holding her underwater. The barn doors creaked open. Inside, hay dust caught the last rays of sunlight filtering through the gaps in the wood, creating an almost cathedral-like atmosphere. She moved past the stalls where their horses stood drowsy and content, checking feed and water with the mechanical efficiency of someone whose hands knew the task by heart, while her mind wandered elsewhere. It was when she approached the back storage area that everything shifted. At first, she thought predator. The shape among the scattered hay was massive enough to register as threat before her conscious mind could process details. But as her eyes adjusted to the dimmer light, the form became clearer. A wolf. Impossibly large for any natural specimen, yet smaller than she might have expected if she'd ever truly considered the possibility of encountering one. The creature was dark-colored, nearly black, with matted fur and visible damage that spoke of violence and flight. Isabel's first instinct was panic. Her second was recognition that this animal was unconscious and posed no immediate threat in its current state. Her third was noticing the blood. So much blood soaking into the hay around the creature's left flank and shoulder, suggesting wounds that should have been fatal hours ago. For several seconds, she couldn't breathe properly. Her mind cycled through impossibilities. Escaped zoo animal? Exotic pet? But no exotic pet would have this particular quality. Something in the structure of the creature that seemed wrong in ways her rational mind couldn't articulate. The proportions were off. The musculature was too defined. The face, even in unconsciousness, held an intelligence that transcended simple animal awareness. She knelt beside the creature, her hands trembling slightly as she assessed without touching. The wounds were severe. Close-range bullet entry, torn muscle, fever-hot skin. Distinct and unmistakable, combined with claw marks that suggested combat with something other than human weaponry. The fur was matted with sweat and blood. The breathing was present but shallow, barely perceptible. There was no exit wound. Whatever slug had entered had not left. Isabel's breath snagged. Not here. Ryder would tell her later. Wrong light, wrong floor. He won't survive sloppy hands. Isabel made her decision without fully understanding why. She couldn't call authorities. No one would believe her. More significantly, this creature would be taken somewhere it didn't belong, to people who would hurt it. Some instinct older than reason urged her toward protection. She worked quickly, moving the wolf carefully using techniques she'd learned during her mother's final illness. The creature was heavy, surprisingly so for something that appeared relatively compact. She pulled blankets from a trunk, arranging them into a nest of softness and warmth. She positioned the wolf with care, trying to minimize additional trauma to the damaged shoulder and flank. Then she went to the house and returned with supplies. Water in a shallow bowl, antiseptic from the bathroom cabinet, clean bandages she'd been meaning to donate. She worked through the evening, moving between house and barn, fabricating stories for her father about animal health issues and fence repairs if he happened to inquire. Thomas didn't ask much. He was accustomed to Isabel's dedication to their property's animals. He didn't press when she explained she'd be doing late inspections. His acceptance felt like permission. The wolf's wounds were infected around the edges, angry and swollen despite the time that had passed since injury. She cleaned as gently as she could manage, her jaw clenched against the guilt of causing additional distress. The creature's body jerked once, a reflexive spasm, but remained mostly unconscious. That was mercy, she supposed. "You're safe now," she whispered to the wolf, though she wasn't entirely certain that was true. She wasn't even certain what she was promising. For 3 nights she maintained this secret. During the day, she moved through her routines with Thomas, making meals, managing the property, answering his occasional questions with increasingly elaborate lies. Her father grew suspicious. She could see it in the way his eyes tracked her movements, in the careful distance he maintained as if he sensed something had shifted. But he didn't press. Thomas had learned long ago that pushing Isabel too hard resulted in defensive silence, and silence terrified him more than outright rebellion. Each evening she returned to the barn with supplies. Water, fresh bandages, food from the kitchen that she could reasonably account for. The wolf remained mostly unconscious, though occasionally its eyes would open with startling clarity. Once, on the second night, the creature made a sound, something between whimper and growl, that suggested consciousness struggling through pain. Isabel sat beside it for hours, simply maintaining presence, her hand hovering above the matted fur without quite touching. On the 3rd day, she recognized something crucial. The wounds were healing faster than should have been possible. The inflammatory response was decreasing. The bullet wound, which should have shown signs of sepsis, was beginning to show clean healing edges. The claw marks that had seemed catastrophic were already beginning to scab over and close. Whatever this creature was, it possessed capabilities that transcended normal animal physiology. Isabel found herself talking to the wolf during these visits, filling the silence with details of her life as if the unconscious animal were a confessor. She told it about her mother, about her father's fear, about the way the farm had become both shelter and suffocation, about the ache of being needed so much that independence felt like betrayal. By the 4th day, she realized something fundamental had shifted inside her. This abandoned creature, this impossible, wounded, supernatural animal, had given her something she didn't know she'd been missing. Purpose that existed outside of obligation. Purpose that was hers alone to define. The wolf's eyes opened more frequently, amber gold eyes that held that disconcerting intelligence. Occasionally they would fix on Isabel's face, and she would see something like gratitude or recognition, though she knew she was probably projecting human emotion onto animal response. The creature never attempted to harm her despite being nearly twice her size, and possessing teeth and claws that could have ended her without effort. Across town, in a house designed for someone who wielded more power than any human government acknowledged, Marcus Devon held his phone with the careful precision of someone accustomed to delivering bad news to worse people. His reflection in the window showed the weariness of a man who'd spent 12 years managing the impossible, serving an alpha king who'd lost faith in his own ability to sustain a dynasty. The call connected on the 3rd ring. Ryder. Marcus's voice was steady, even as the information he carried threatened to destabilize everything. "We have a situation. The boy, Julian, he transformed." In the silence that followed, Marcus could almost hear the sound of Ryder's world rearranging itself. Transformation cycle began. The Alpha King's voice came through carefully controlled. Dangerous. The kind of calm that preceded violence. He was supposed to have years before. Grace miscalculated. Marcus interrupted. Or the lunar cycle was stronger than she anticipated. The transformation was involuntary and violent. The boy panicked. He couldn't control the shift back. She lost him during the chaos. More silence. Marcus waited. This was Ryder's version of processing. The pause before the storm. Where is he? Unknown. During the transformation, he was spotted by a human with a gear. Grant Henderson. The man fired. The boy was struck and fled in wolf form. Grace has been unable to locate him. She reached out through underground channels looking for assistance. "So my son," Ryder said with precision that suggested each word was being carved from something harder than language, "who I didn't know existed until this moment, has been shot, traumatized by transformation, and is now missing in wolf form somewhere in Pennsylvania. That is the situation," Marcus confirmed. "I'm mobilizing resources to locate him. Shifter tracking can find him within hours. The problem is that Corvus likely knows by now," Ryder finished, that any movement we make broadcasts his location to rivals who'd use him against me. Find him, Marcus. Immediately. I want coordinates within the hour. The line went dead. Marcus was already dialing other numbers, beginning the cascade of communication that would set dozens of shifters in motion across the region. But his mind had snagged on a particular detail. Ryder Thorne, Alpha King of the entire North American territory, had just learned he was a father, and more significantly, he'd learned this fact about the same moment learning his son had been shot. In the barn in Pennsylvania, the wolf whose true nature Isabel didn't yet comprehend continued its slow healing, unaware that its existence were already aligning to change the shape of his world. The creature's eyes occasionally opened, those impossible amber gold eyes, and seemed to focus on Isabel's face with an awareness that suggested consciousness deeper than any animal should possess. Isabel sat beside the wounded wolf through the night, her hand finally allowing itself to rest on the warm fur, and recognized that the isolation of her father's farm had prepared her for exactly this impossibility. She was no longer alone, and that changed everything. Chapter 2. When the king arrived. The night air had turned sharp by the time Ryder Thorne descended from his vehicle, the expensive leather of his shoes crunching against the gravel approach to the Hartford property. He moved with the deliberate precision of someone accustomed to commanding space through presence alone, not hurried gestures or unnecessary movement. Behind him, Marcus remained positioned a quarter-mile back, communication maintained through the silent language of Alpha and Beta, a form of mental connection that predated human speech and superseded it in every meaningful way. Ryder had spent the drive from the city in a state of controlled fury. 12 years. 12 years of not knowing, of continuing to build an empire while a child bearing his blood had been living a human life in complete ignorance of what he was. The thought sat in his chest like something toxic, something that needed to be expelled through action or violence or both. And now, just when he'd begun to accept that loss, the universe had delivered his son directly into danger. The barn was larger than he'd expected from Marcus's description. Red wood faded by decades of weather, structure still sound but carrying the weight of age. He could sense his son's presence from 50 yards away, that distinctive hum of shifter energy that Marcus had locked onto, a frequency that would be invisible to human perception, but screamed to someone of Ryder's status. The boy was alive. Wounded, but alive. He moved through the barn doors without announcing himself, letting his eyes adjust to the interior dimness. The animals registered his presence first, horses shifting in their stalls with an unease that spoke to the predatory nature radiating from him. But he paid them no attention. His focus narrowed to a single point, the figure of a woman kneeling in the shadows near the storage area, positioned protectively in front of a dark form. What Ryder saw made his breath stop. The creature before him was a wolf, not full-sized, but substantial, its dark coat matted with sweat and blood. The animal lay among scattered hay, still unconscious, its flank rising and falling with labored breaths. But more significantly, Ryder recognized the energy signature radiating from the creature's form. It was unmistakably his own bloodline. His son, existing in predator form, wounded and being tended by a human woman who had no possible comprehension of what she was protecting. "Step away from him," Ryder commanded, his voice carrying the weight of authority that came from being recognized, on some primal level, as apex predator. Slowly, Isabel's head snapped up. In the half-light, he could see the moment her body recognized something her mind couldn't yet process, the visceral understanding that this man was dangerous in ways that transcended physical threat. She didn't move immediately. "I said move." This time, the words carried the compulsion that came with his station, the supernatural weight of command that bent human will toward obedience. It wasn't full dominance. He could have crushed her will entirely if he chose. But it was enough. Isabel shifted backward, her body responding to forces she didn't understand. The wolf, his son, remained unconscious, unaware that his father had arrived. Ryder knelt, and in that moment, everything in him crystallized into focus. The creature's facial structure carried his features rendered in predator form, softened by youth, but still unmistakably bearing his bloodline. The dark coloring, the bone structure beneath the fur, even the way the young wolf held itself, despite obvious pain and trauma. carried an echo of the bearing Ryder recognized in his own reflection. "How long has he been here?" Ryder asked without looking at the woman. Isabel's voice emerged small and confused. 4 nights. "I found him. Found it. In here. I didn't know what else to do." "You found this creature," Ryder continued, his hands moving with careful intention, examining the wounds without touching the wolf directly, "and decided to care for it rather than call authorities." "He was hurt," Isabel said, and there was something in her voice, some stubborn core that had kept her functioning on a farm that had slowly been suffocating her, that refused to diminish under his scrutiny. And calling authorities seemed like a good way to get him killed. Whatever he is. Ryder rose to his full height, and even from her position on the floor, Isabel could sense the absolute authority that seemed to emanate from his very being. His pale eyes scanned her with the methodical precision of someone conducting an assessment at levels that had nothing to do with human logic. Finally, he nodded. "What is your name?" "Isabel Hartford. This is my family's property." "Isabel," he repeated. "I'm going to tell you something that you will keep to yourself, because the alternative to your silence is considerably more painful than you're prepared to experience. What you see before you isn't a normal animal. It is something else entirely. It is what I am. What he is." Isabel's mind rejected the information, even as her body seemed to already believe it. But before she could formulate a response, Ryder demonstrated. His transformation was partial, a controlled shifting that brought his hand forward as it began to change, fingers elongating into something inhuman, nails becoming talons, skin taking on a texture that seemed to exist between human and animal. The change lasted only seconds before he reversed it, his hand returning to its human form. The room seemed to contract around Isabel's inability to breathe properly. "We are shifters," Ryder continued, his tone suggesting he was explaining something as simple as weather patterns. "What you see before you isn't human. The child is under my protection. I didn't know he existed until today. His mother kept his existence secret for 12 years. That secrecy was protection against a world you don't understand, and don't need to understand. What you do need to understand is that there are people looking for him. People who would use him as leverage against me. People who would not hesitate to eliminate anyone who interferes with their plans." The wolf on the ground stirred slightly, consciousness beginning to surface through the layers of trauma and exhaustion. Its amber gold eyes flickered open, confused and disoriented. When they found Ryder's face, something shifted, recognition at a level that transcended conscious understanding. "His name is Julian," Ryder said, lowering himself to the ground beside his son. His hand, now fully human, rested gently on the dark fur. "And he's been shot because he transformed for the first time, without training or preparation. Everything that's happened to him in the past 4 days represents a catastrophe of circumstance that no child should endure." Isabel watched as the Alpha King, because she now understood, with absolute certainty, that was what he was, touched his son with tenderness that seemed impossible given his predatory bearing. The wolf's eyes closed again, and she realized the animal had recognized its father through some sense she didn't possess and couldn't begin to comprehend. "I need you to keep him here," Ryder said, "for 5, perhaps 6 more days. I'll return each night with medications that his human doctors could never provide. During the day, you maintain your normal routines. You tell no one. You give no indication that anything has changed. Can you do that?" Isabel's silence was her answer. Ryder leaned in, voice pitched for her alone. "Privately, he is my son. I learned it today. Keep that between us until he's strong enough to hear it. Your compliance is not optional," Ryder continued. "But there was no cruelty in it, merely the statement of fact. But you should know that your family will be protected. I don't reward betrayal, but I'm not in the habit of harming those who prove useful. Protect my son. And you've purchased the safety of everyone you care about." It took Isabel several attempts to find her voice. "What if I can't? What if he gets worse?" "You will find a way to contact Marcus Devon," Ryder said, gesturing slightly. As if summoned by mention of his name, a figure appeared in the barn's entrance. A man with dark hair and intelligent eyes that assessed Isabel with complete neutrality. "He will be monitoring the property. Any significant deterioration, any complication, you will signal him." Understood. Understood, Isabel whispered. The Alpha King spent the next hour administering care that Isabel barely understood. Medicaments that seemed to accelerate the healing process, applied directly to the wolf's wounds. Careful monitoring of the creature's vital signs using techniques and instruments that suggested knowledge transcending veterinary medicine. Throughout it all, Ryder's movements were efficient, but not cold. There was something almost tender in the way he touched his son's head, in the careful attention he paid to Julian's comfort. When it was complete, Ryder looked at Isabel. "I'll return tomorrow night. Same time. If anything changes, if he becomes unable to wake, if fever returns with intensity, if there's any deterioration, Marcus will be watching." And then he was gone, moving back through the barn with the same fluid grace he'd arrived with. Disappearing into the darkness outside, Isabel sat beside the wolf, who had finally surrendered to exhausted sleep, her mind struggling to process that the world had abruptly become a place where werewolves were real, and she'd somehow become guardian to a supernatural child whose father was apparently something far more dangerous than any human threat could be. Outside, Ryder moved through the night toward Marcus, his hands gripping into fists with enough force to leave marks. In 12 years of believing his son dead, he'd constructed a kind of emotional armor. In 2 hours, a wounded animal and a protective human woman had breached it completely, leaving him vulnerable to possibilities he'd learned not to entertain. By morning, preparations would be underway. By nightfall, he would return to that barn and begin the impossible task of teaching a traumatized young shifter about the violent, beautiful, devastating nature of what he'd been born to become, while also managing the political complications that his son's existence represented to every rival alpha who'd ever questioned his fitness to rule. The wounded wolf slept on in the barn, unaware that its presence were already aligning to change the shape of his world. Chapter 3. The Breaking Point. The 7 days that followed transformed the barn into something between sanctuary and interrogation chamber of identity. Ryder arrived each evening as the sun descended below the tree line, moving through the property with the ease of someone accustomed to operating outside conventional boundaries. He brought things Isabel couldn't comprehend. Small vials containing luminescent substances, powders that smelled of earth and minerals, and knowledge that seemed to exist in a language beyond human understanding. Julian's recovery was extraordinary in ways that transcended physical healing. The wolf remained largely unconscious through the first days, but gradually the amber gold eyes began opening with increasing frequency and clarity. Those amber gold eyes held something distinctly non-animal when they focused. A consciousness that suggested the child trapped inside predator form was slowly returning to awareness. Isabel found herself speaking to the creature, narrating her movements, offering comfort to something that shouldn't have needed comfort in the way humans understood it. Ryder's approach to his son was different when they were alone. Isabel would observe from careful distances as the Alpha King placed his hand on the dark fur, and something would pass between them, a communication that transcended species and language. She realized that shifters possessed some form of telepathic connection, a way of speaking that required no words. Once, she caught fragments. Ryder's mental voice carrying patience mixed with frustration, Julian's responses radiating confusion and fear, a father attempting to compress years of cultural education into days of recovery. By day 5, Julian could stand. The wolf's movements were tentative, favoring the shoulder where the bullet had struck, but functional. Isabel watched as the creature began moving through the barn spaces, relearning how to navigate the world. The horse in the adjacent stall expressed no fear. Animals recognized something about Julian that transcended threat. There was an otherness to him that communicated itself without language. Ryder began more direct instruction as the week progressed. The Alpha King would spend hours in the barn with his son, and through careful observation and occasionally overheard fragments of that telepathic communication, Isabel pieced together what was happening. Ryder was teaching Julian about shifter society through mental connection, the hierarchy, the importance of control, the devastating consequences of uncontrolled transformation. He was attempting to prepare a child who'd been raised human for a reality that existed in dimensions that human upbringing could never accommodate. The hierarchy exists for reason, Ryder explained to Isabel during one of his nighttime arrivals, speaking aloud perhaps for her benefit, or perhaps because the weight of what he needed to communicate demanded human language. Shifters without control are danger to themselves and their communities. Julian's transformation was catastrophic because he had no framework for what was happening. The pain, the disorientation, the involuntary shift in consciousness, all of it overwhelmed him. "Can he control it now?" Isabel asked. "No," Ryder answered simply. "But he will learn." By day 11, as the barn was settling into deepening autumn and Thomas was expressing increasing suspicion about Isabel's nocturnal habits, Ryder made an announcement that vibrated through the space between them. "Tomorrow night, he transforms," Ryder told the wolf, his words carrying authority and something deeper. "Deliberately, with training, not the way it happened before. This time you'll have control. This time you'll have understanding. This time you'll have me." Isabel heard the promise in those words. Not just of safety, but of presence. Of not being alone in the transformation that had previously been catastrophic violation. The transformation training happened on the evening of day 12. Ryder arrived earlier than usual, as the light was still holding in shades of orange and gold. He communicated something to Julian through that silent language, and the wolf, having spent days in that form, having begun to understand its own capabilities, moved toward the barn's exit with purpose. Isabel watched them disappear into the darkening tree line, feeling the weight of isolation settle across her shoulders. She told herself this was necessary. She told herself she trusted Ryder's judgment, despite the fact that trust in this context felt like faith in something too vast to fully comprehend. In the forest clearing where moonlight penetrated the canopy and offered space for what was to come, Ryder brought his son to understanding. The instruction was equal parts meditation and combat training, though Julian didn't yet comprehend the second aspect. "The transformation isn't invasion," Ryder communicated through the mental channels that connected them. "It's integration. Your human consciousness and your wolf consciousness. They're not fighting for control. They're two parts of the same being. You're not surrendering to the wolf. You're inviting it. You're acknowledging that both forms are you." Julian's wolf form trembled with concentration. "Breathe," Ryder continued. "Feel your heartbeat. Feel the energy beneath your fur. It's there always. Right now you're just learning to acknowledge it, to accept it, to let it express itself. The transformation, when it finally came, happened with controlled intention. The wolf's form shifted, bones restructuring, fur receding, consciousness expanding into human awareness. When the process completed, a small boy stood naked and shaking in the moonlight, no longer than 12 years old, his dark hair wet with the transformation's exertion. His pale eyes, so like his father's, reflected terror and wonder in equal measure. Ryder, in response, allowed his own form to shift into that massive predator state, demonstrating the size and power that an adult alpha commanded. But when he approached, it was with deliberate slowness and invitation rather than dominance. The great wolf's presence was meant to teach, not intimidate. They ran together through the forest. Julian discovered speed and grace that human legs could never achieve. He learned how predator senses operated, how scent told stories about the world, how movement communicated intention through landscapes where human civilization rarely ventured. There was pure liberation in it, the particular joy that comes when a creature discovers capabilities it never knew it possessed. It was nearly perfect, nearly enough to make the boy forget that his world had shattered 12 days earlier. The hunters appeared without warning, though in retrospect, there had been signs Ryder simply hadn't caught because his attention was consumed by his son. Grant Henderson had spent the preceding day organizing neighbors with growing urgency. He'd convinced himself that whatever he'd glimpsed days earlier was a sick coyote or a bad trick of moonlight. Tonight, he meant to prove to himself the thing hadn't been real at all. They emerged from the tree line with lights and dogs, and the particular darkness that comes when human fear transforms into collective violence. Julian's instincts during transformation weren't yet refined enough to process threat appropriately. When he smelled humans and heard the sounds of the hunt, something primal triggered wrongly. The young wolf, still intoxicated by the freedom of his new form, turned toward the sounds instead of away from them. Grant saw the wolf first. Even in darkness, Even with only moonlight and flashlights, he recognized this as not a natural animal. This was the same creature he'd glimpsed before. Wrong in ways his conscious mind rejected, but his instincts recognized as threat. Julian buckled as pain tore through his shoulder and thigh, the old wound flaring with brutal intensity. The boy's screams were things that transcended species, that carried nothing but raw suffering. Human voice mixed with animal cry, consciousness fractured between forms. Ryder gathered his son as the boy was shifting back to human state, bones breaking and reforming in sequences that was torture in physical manifestation. He held the child against his chest, one hand protective over the aggravated wound along his left side, and moved through the darkness with a father's desperate need to reach safety. When Ryder reached Isabel's barn carrying a bleeding, traumatized boy who was oscillating between human and wolf form as his body struggled to protect itself, his rage was barely contained beneath a surface of professional demand. "Everything," he commanded, his voice carrying that supernatural weight that bent human will to obedience. "Any medical supplies you have. Now." Isabel moved through the night in a daze of action, providing what she had, watching as Ryder worked with hands that were steady despite the fury radiating from him. Julian was sedated. Ryder produced something from his collection of impossible medications that pulled the boy into unconsciousness and away from the immediate agony. The night stretched endlessly. Isabel remained present because leaving felt like betrayal, though she understood less than nothing about what she was witnessing. Ryder worked with focused precision, his movements becoming more economical as exhaustion threatened, but never claimed him. He worked as both father and healer, combining instinct with knowledge born from centuries of existence. When dawn began threatening the darkness outside, Julian was stable, but traumatized profoundly. The accelerated regenerative process had healed the bullet wound partially, but the psychological damage was severe. A child who'd been excited by newfound capability had been reminded in the most brutal way that the world contained forces that wanted him dead. Ryder sat beside his son, watching the boy's face as he slept the medicated sleep of the severely injured. And for the first time since arriving at the property, the Alpha King allowed something like vulnerability to cross his features. The guilt of a father who'd tried to teach his son to fly, and had instead delivered him directly to predators who saw only threat. Chapter 4. Promises Kept and Broken. Ryder cut clean and fast with Isabel bracing, Grant's jacket pressed into service as a pad. The boy seized and then went limp, breath still in him. Ryder worked by feel and judgment, drawing the dark, ugly metal free. "Got you," he said softly. "Stitch." They closed him, layered and precise, heat pouring off his skin as the fever finally began to break. The barn became something other than itself in the aftermath of violence. It transformed into a space suspended between veterinary care and something infinitely more complex. A sanctuary where human compassion met supernatural healing, where the boundaries between species dissolved beneath shared need for survival. Julian remained unconscious through most of the first night, his dark wolf form sprawled across blankets arranged with careful intention. Ryder worked with methodical precision, applying medications that seemed to accelerate cellular regeneration in ways that transcended conventional understanding. It wasn't a new wound at all. The earlier slug had drifted and inflamed tissue under strain. The flesh had begun accelerated repair the moment Ryder removed the metal, but the psychological damage was catastrophic. Isabel moved through the darkness like a ghost, fetching supplies at Ryder's direction, her hands shaking with a tremor she couldn't control. The work was mechanical and essential in equal measure. She watched as the Alpha King applied substances she couldn't name to wounds that seemed to defy human medical knowledge. What fascinated and terrified her most was the way Ryder's hands trembled slightly when they touched his son's fur. This man who commanded absolute authority, who radiated predatory confidence, was genuinely frightened. The wolf's consciousness flickered in and out through the medicated haze. When Julian's amber eyes opened, they held confusion and suffering in equal measure. The boy's mind, still fractured between human understanding and wolf instinct, couldn't fully process what had happened. He'd begun to trust his new form. He'd experienced the liberation of it. And then violence had reminded him that existence was fragile. Ryder maintained constant mental contact with his son through those long hours. Isabel caught fragments of their communication, Ryder's mental voice carrying patience mixed with devastation, Julian's responses radiating pain and fear and betrayal. A father attempting to comfort a child who'd learned that the world contained forces far more terrible than any nightmare. By morning, Julian had stabilized into something approaching sleep, though Isabel suspected sedation rather than natural rest. Ryder sat motionless beside his son, his pale eyes fixed on the wolf's dark form with an intensity that suggested he was watching for any sign of deterioration. In the weak light filtering through the barn's gaps, she could see the toll the night had extracted. The way Ryder's shoulders seemed to carry additional weight, the tight line of his jaw, the barely contained fury radiating from him like heat from a forge. When Thomas appeared in the barn doorway carrying coffee in a thermos, a gesture born from decades of farm routine that recognized no exceptions, even when the world had fundamentally shifted, the moment crystallized into terrible clarity. He saw his daughter, exhausted, stained with blood that wasn't hers, kneeling beside a wounded wolf and an impossible man. He saw the evidence of a secret that had metastasized into something beyond simple concealment. "There was an accident," Isabel said, her voice steady through sheer force of will. "My friend found an injured animal and brought it here. We're helping it recover before releasing it back into—" "I'm not stupid," Thomas interrupted, his voice carrying a weight of exhaustion that suggested he'd aged a decade in the past 12 days. "I'm not going to pretend I believe that story. But I also understand that asking questions will only complicate situations that are already beyond my comprehension." He set the thermos on a hay bale and turned to leave, but Ryder's voice stopped him, not commanding, but carrying that particular quality that demanded attention regardless. "Your daughter has protected my son when no one else could," Ryder said. The wolf beside him stirred slightly at the sound of Ryder's voice, and though the creature remained unconscious, something in its posture shifted toward comfort. "That protection has come at cost to her reputation, her safety, her relationship with you. That debt will not be forgotten." Thomas looked at the man who'd addressed him, his eyes taking in details that his mind struggled to categorize. There was something fundamentally wrong about this man in ways that transcended simple physical wrongness. There was an otherness to him that made Thomas's primal instincts scream warnings about predators and territory and the boundaries between human and something else entirely. "I don't want your debt," Thomas said finally. "I want my daughter safe. I want normal life to resume. I want—" He stopped, recognizing the impossibility of the wanting. "I want what's best for Isabel. Then we share an objective," Ryder responded. That evening, Isabel found herself sitting across from her father at the kitchen table, the same location where they'd shared countless meals for the past 26 years. The space felt different now. Contracted, loaded with the weight of unspoken knowledge. Thomas poured coffee with ritual precision, and Isabel found herself noticing details she'd overlooked through years of familiarity. The tremor in his hands, the way grief had mapped itself across his face in lines that hadn't been there when her mother was alive. "I need to ask you something," Thomas said, "and I need you to be truthful with me." Isabel waited, her own coffee cooling between her hands. "Is this creature, is the animal in the barn, going to hurt you? Is it going to hurt anyone here?" "No," Isabel answered, and meant it with complete certainty. "He's just a child who was injured and terrified. He couldn't hurt anyone even if he wanted to." "That's not what I asked," Thomas said gently. "I asked if he will hurt you." The distinction hung between them, heavy with implication. "The man, Ryder, he'll protect me," Isabel said. "He and the animal, they're not what we are, but that doesn't make them dangerous to us. Not if we keep their secret." Thomas was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of decision made against every instinct toward normalcy and safety. "There will be consequences if anyone finds out what's happening in that barn. Not just for you and for me, but for that creature. Bad people will want him if they know he exists." "I know," Isabel whispered. "If anyone comes to this property asking questions about the animal or about the man, anyone at all, I'm calling the authorities. I have to. I need to be able to say truthfully that I reported it if questions come later. Do you understand?" Isabel understood. She understood that her father was creating a boundary that would protect them all if things fell apart. She understood that he was asking her to accept a promise that could ultimately betray Julian if circumstances shifted toward discovery. She understood that Thomas was offering her the most profound gift he could provide, the space to make her own choices, even when those choices terrified him. "I understand," she said. That night, after Thomas had retreated to his room, Isabel found herself sitting alone in the barn, with only the animals for company. Ryder had returned to wherever Alpha Kings retreated when their immediate crises passed. The wolf lay sleeping, sedated, his breathing steady and deep. The barn was warm, filled with the smell of hay and the distant sounds of animals settling into sleep. She thought about the choice she'd made, the decision to keep a secret that couldn't be kept forever, to commit herself to a creature she'd known for less than 2 weeks, to stand at the edge of a world that operated by rules she didn't understand. She thought about what it meant to be needed by something that depended entirely on her compassion. In the darkness of the barn, surrounded by hay and blankets, and the faint sounds of the injured wolf's breathing, Isabel Hartford recognized that the life she'd known before that first night of discovery was truly over. She'd crossed some invisible threshold where return had become impossible, where she'd committed herself to protecting something that the ordinary world could never acknowledge. She didn't know yet that this decision would eventually cost her everything she'd ever known. She didn't know that it would also give her something she'd been searching for without recognizing the absence. She knew only that the wolf in the barn needed her, that Ryder Thorne had recognized something in her that transcended ordinary human capability, and that her father had offered her the most complicated blessing he could provide, the permission to choose her own destiny, even if it meant stepping into darkness. Chapter 5. The Weight of Necessary Choices. The days following Julian's collapse in the forest existed in a state of compressed urgency that made time feel simultaneously endless and impossibly brief. Ryder moved through the property like someone operating on levels of exhaustion that would have killed an ordinary man. But the Alpha King had never been ordinary. He was something that transcended human limitation. Though even he, with all his centuries of accumulated power, couldn't entirely suppress the guilt that carved itself across his features when he believed no one was watching. Grant Henderson had become something unexpected, a man silenced not by threat, but by the sheer weight of cognitive dissonance. He'd spent 3 days attempting to construct rational narratives around what he'd witnessed in that forest. A man moving with impossible speed. A child, transforming. The complete defiance of everything his rational mind insisted was possible. By the 4th day, Grant had settled into a kind of willful amnesia, reporting to animal control that any predator had clearly retreated, that increased foot traffic alone had probably been enough to scare it away. No one needed to investigate further. No one needed to ask harder questions. Grant would maintain his silence not through fear of explicit threat, but through the simple recognition that speaking truth would make him sound insane. Ryder monitored this silence through Marcus, who maintained surveillance on the property using methods that didn't require physical presence. When Marcus reported that Grant had effectively neutralized as a threat through his own psychological processing, Ryder allowed himself the first moment of relief he'd experienced since learning of his son's existence. But relief was a luxury that couldn't be sustained. That same evening, Marcus brought information that shifted everything toward acceleration. Corvus has moved resources into the region, Marcus said through the silent communication that passed between Alpha and Beta. He's acquired intelligence about the boy, nothing confirmed yet, but movement suggests he knows something. Ryder processed this in the way he processed all catastrophic information, by immediately implementing contingency protocols that had been formulated for exactly this scenario. There was no time for the careful recovery Julian required. There was no luxury of gradual healing and gentle integration into understanding his own nature. Everything had to compress into a fraction of the timeline originally planned. That night, Ryder spoke to Isabel, while Julian slept the medicated sleep that kept the worst of the pain at bay. They stood in the shadows of the barn, the weight of decision hanging between them like something physical. "We're leaving," Ryder said simply. "Tomorrow night. I need you to gather what you can carry without arousing suspicion." Isabel's first instinct was protest. The second was recognition of necessity. "How long until we return?" "I don't know," Ryder answered, with the brutal honesty that she'd come to expect from him. "Julian needs protection that I can't provide here. There are those in my world who would use him against me. They're beginning to understand he exists. She understood, though the understanding carried weight that threatened to crush her. She understood that she was being asked to abandon the life she'd known, to leave her father, to step into a world that operated by rules she didn't comprehend, to stand at the side of a man and child who inhabited a reality that human perception was never meant to accommodate. What about my father? The question emerged smaller than she'd intended. Tell him the truth, Ryder said, as much truth as he can bear. Give him the ability to say, if questioned later, that you left for personal reasons. Give him the safety of plausible deniability. That conversation happened the following evening, after Ryder had left to coordinate logistics with Marcus and the network of shifters who served as resources for the Alpha King. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, his coffee cold in front of him, as Isabel explained that she needed to leave, that the child in the barn and his father represented complications that extended beyond the boundaries of their farm, that staying would only create danger for all of them. How long? Thomas asked, his voice suggesting he already knew the answer wouldn't provide comfort. I don't know, Isabel said, mirroring Ryder's earlier honesty. Possibly a long time. Thomas was quiet for what felt like years compressed into minutes. If anyone asks, I'll tell them you received an opportunity for work in the city, that you decided to pursue your own life, that I don't know where you went. I know, Isabel whispered. And if circumstances change, Thomas continued, his eyes still fixed on his coffee cup, as if the dark liquid held answers to questions he couldn't articulate. If you're ever in danger or in real trouble, you'll find a way to contact me. I will, Isabel promised, recognizing this for what it was. Her father's way of offering blessing despite his fear. They held each other that night with the kind of embrace that carries finality. Thomas smelled like the farm, like soil and work, and the specific scent of a life lived in one place for decades. Isabel memorized it, understanding that this might be the last time she stood in the kitchen that had been the center of her existence for 26 years. The actual departure happened with an almost surreal simplicity. Marcus arrived with a vehicle that was unremarkable in every way, the kind of transportation that wouldn't draw attention passing through small towns at night. Julian was carefully secured in the back, his wound still healing but stable enough for travel. Isabel sat beside the boy, her single bag of possessions beside her, watching the Pennsylvania landscape slide past the windows in darkness. Ryder drove separately, maintaining the kind of distance that would prevent any single surveillance identifying them as a unit. They would meet at a way station roughly an hour north, a property that Marcus had secured through shifter networks, a safe house that existed in the liminal space between human and supernatural geography. That departure was when Isabel's attachment truly solidified. She sat beside Julian as miles accumulated between them and the life she'd known, watching the boy sleep fitfully against the window, his small face still carrying the trauma of everything that had happened. She understood in that moment that she'd irrevocably crossed some boundary. She'd chosen this child and this man and this impossible world over the comfortable prison of her father's farm. When they reached the way station, a nondescript house in the midst of 100 similar houses in a mid-sized town, Ryder was waiting. He pulled Isabel aside while Marcus settled Julian in a bedroom, explaining in careful terms what would happen next. You can't return to that life, he said, his pale eyes carrying something that might have been regret, or might have been recognition of the sacrifice he was asking her to make. There are those who would use you as leverage against me if they knew you existed. You have to disappear into my world entirely, or you have to disappear entirely from connection to us. I've already chosen, Isabel said quietly. What happened next was unexpected and inevitable in equal measure. Ryder kissed her with the intensity of someone who'd been holding back an eruption of need through sheer force of will. His hands, typically controlled and precise, became something more urgent. It was connection born from shared trauma and mutual recognition that they'd both sacrificed the normal world for something neither of them entirely understood. When they pulled apart, Ryder's forehead rested against hers, and she could feel the tension that existed in every muscle of his body, the constant awareness that threatened and danger were never truly distant in his world. I'm asking you to trust me with your life, he said. I'm asking you to step into a reality that will frighten you regularly, I'm asking you to accept that the man I am isn't limited by human morality or human law. I already know what you are, Isabel replied. I've known since the barn, and I chose anyway. Outside, the night settled over their small sanctuary, and somewhere in the back of the house, Julian slept the sleep of the traumatized, his young mind slowly beginning to process the magnitude of the changes that had irrevocably reshaped his existence. Behind them, in a farmhouse in Pennsylvania, Thomas Hartford sat in his kitchen drinking cold coffee and accepting that his daughter had walked into a world he could never follow. The old life was gone. Whatever came next would exist in territories that human understanding was never meant to navigate. But in that liminal space, with Ryder's hand holding hers and Julian sleeping in safety nearby, Isabel Hartford recognized that she'd finally found something that the isolation of her father's farm had never provided. Purpose that was entirely her own, chosen with full knowledge of its cost. Chapter 6. When Kings Face Judgment. The city swallowed them into its vastness with the kind of indifference that urban centers reserved for those attempting to disappear within them. Ryder maintained 3 separate residences across the metropolitan landscape, sanctuaries that existed in the liminal space between human and shifter geography, spaces designed with the specific intention of concealing those who needed to remain invisible to the ordinary world. The one he chose for their arrival was located in the upper reaches of a high-rise building that occupied an entire city block, protected by security systems that blended human technology with safeguards that no conventional algorithm could decode. Isabel found herself in spaces larger than her father's entire farmhouse. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of a city that sprawled in every direction, a landscape of human civilization that seemed almost alien compared to the isolation she'd inhabited for 26 years. She moved through the apartment with the caution of someone navigating someone else's territory, aware that she was present only through the specific permission of the man who owned it. Julian required constant care during those initial days. His healing, accelerated by shifter physiology, still demanded vigilant monitoring. Isabel appointed herself his primary guardian during the daylight hours, watching the color gradually return to his face, observing as the trauma that had carved itself across his features began its slow process of retreat. The boy remained withdrawn, processing not just physical injury, but the catastrophic reorientation of his understanding regarding what he was and what the world actually contained. Ryder was absent with increasing frequency as the first week progressed. He would depart in the evenings and return in the deep darkness of early morning, carrying the weight of conversations that Isabel could only partially comprehend. Through fragmented explanations, she learned that he was managing political complications that extended far beyond the immediate crisis of his son's existence. The world beneath the human world, the shifter society that operated according to laws and hierarchies that predated human government by millennia, was stirring with recognition of Julian's existence. On day 23, Marcus arrived with information that shifted the tempo of everything toward acceleration. Corvus has moved openly, Marcus reported to Ryder in the private study that occupied the apartment's eastern corner. Isabel observed from the adjacent space, pretending indifference while absorbing every detail she could interpret. He's distributed knowledge of the boy to his faction. Conservative alphas are expressing concern about the legitimacy of an heir raised outside shifter culture. The narrative he's constructing is that Julian is contaminated by human upbringing. Ryder's response was controlled fury maintained beneath a surface of absolute precision. Then we move to confrontation. Assemble the council. I'm bringing evidence of Julian's legitimacy before the entire authority structure. That's unprecedented, Marcus said carefully. Bringing a human woman and an untrained adolescent shifter into the council chambers? It's necessary, Ryder interrupted. They want to question my fitness as Alpha King. They want to suggest my son is unsuitable as heir. They'll see exactly who my son is, and they'll understand that the woman standing beside him has sacrificed more for his survival than any of them would recognize. The announcement that Isabel was expected to appear before the Council of Alphas arrived with all the diplomatic grace of an avalanche. Ryder explained it to her in terms designed to be clear, but offered minimal comfort. They're going to challenge your presence, he told her, his pale eyes carrying that particular intensity that made her spine straighten involuntarily. They're going to suggest you represent weakness or risk. You're going to stand there and demonstrate that human understanding transcends their expectations. You're going to be the evidence that my decision to trust you was sound. What if I'm not? Isabel asked. The question emerged smaller than she'd intended. Then we'll manage the consequences, Ryder said simply. But you will be, because you've already proven yourself beyond the limitations of their comprehension. The council chambers existed in a building that occupied neutral territory, a structure maintained by shifter governance and protected by laws that human authorities would never recognize. Isabel dressed in clothing Ryder selected for her, dark colors that projected both sophistication and refusal to perform femininity as weapon. She followed him into spaces where the air itself seemed to carry weight, where the presence of beings who could shift between human and predator created a pressure that transcended conventional sensory experience. The council consisted of 15 alphas, each representing territories that stretched across the North American continent. Ryder held the central position, Alpha King, supreme authority, but his position was not beyond question. That was what Corvus understood. That was what he was manipulating. Corvus himself was present, his physical form radiating the kind of muscular confidence that came from leading a successful pack. His eyes carried the particular cruelty of someone who recognized vulnerability and devoted himself to exploiting it. When Ryder brought Isabel forward, Corvus smiled with the satisfaction of a predator recognizing wounded prey. The Alpha King arrives with his human, Corvus announced, his voice carrying that particular quality designed to make the observation sound degrading. Is this where our supreme leader now draws counsel? From those beneath our nature? Ryder's response was delivered with the calm precision of someone unconcerned by provocation. This is Isabel Hartford. She protected my son when no member of our world would. She sustained his life when conventional shifter care could not reach him. She abandoned her entire existence to ensure his survival. She stands before you as evidence of character that transcends species. An older alpha, one with gray threading through his hair and eyes that suggested decades of accumulated wisdom, leaned forward. The boy. You claim he is your biological heir? He is, Ryder confirmed. Fathered 12 years ago with a human woman. Raised human until his transformation cycle began. Now under my protection and guidance. The chamber erupted into discussion that carried overlapping voices and political undercurrents that Isabel could only partially interpret. But the central conflict emerged clearly enough. Some of the alphas recognized Ryder's genetic claim to produce an heir. Others, aligned with Corvus through various political entanglements, questioned whether a child raised outside shifter culture could possibly understand the responsibility of potential leadership. Corvus made his move with the precision of a predator executing a calculated strike. I propose a test, he announced, his voice cutting through the competing conversations. Let the boy participate in a challenge. If he survives, his legitimacy is proven. If he fails, he demonstrates he is unsuitable for any position of significance in our world. Ryder's response was absolute refusal, delivered with a rage so controlled it seemed almost gentle. The boy was injured 3 weeks ago. He's 12 years old. He's still processing the basic mechanics of transformation. You're proposing a test that would guarantee his failure and probably his death. If he is truly your son, Corvus countered, surely his shifter nature would protect him from consequences that would injure a lesser creature. The test is rejected, Ryder said, his voice carrying weight that seemed to vibrate through the chamber's physical structure. I will not risk my son to satisfy your political ambitions. Then you acknowledge he is unsuitable, Corvus pressed. You acknowledge that the heir of the Alpha King is compromised by human weakness. Isabel found herself moving forward, her movement prompted by something that transcended conscious decision. The chamber's attention pivoted toward her, and she felt the weight of supernatural scrutiny being applied to her physical form. He's a child, she said, her voice steady through sheer force of will. A child who was abandoned by your entire world until his father found him. A child who's been traumatized by violence and confusion. If your test is whether a traumatized 12-year-old can survive immediate challenges, then your test is designed to fail. That's not legitimacy measurement. That's cruelty disguised as governance. Silence. Complete absolute silence that seemed to compress the air around her. An alpha woman, one with dark eyes and posture that suggested dangerous competence, began to laugh. The Alpha King's human speaks with more sense than most of our council possesses. I propose an alternative, Ryder announced, and Isabel recognized this for what it was, the move he'd been planning since learning of Corvus's challenge. Let Julian participate in a true test of leadership. He will be placed in a community that requires unified healing. He will have 90 days to demonstrate the qualities required of a potential heir, not destruction or immediate violence. Actual leadership, community restoration, character. The debate that followed extended for hours. Isabel stood beside Ryder throughout, feeling the scrutiny of beings who existed in dimensions of power she didn't fully comprehend. But gradually, the council consensus shifted. Even Corvus's faction couldn't effectively argue against a test that would be conducted outside their direct influence. By the time Ryder and Isabel left the council chambers, the basic parameters had been established. Julian would be removed from Sanctuary. He would be placed in a fractured shifter community with specific objectives. He would be given 90 days to prove that an heir raised partially in human context could still embody the qualities necessary for leadership. In the vehicle returning to the apartment, Ryder reached for Isabel's hand, his grip carrying gratitude and something deeper that neither of them had fully articulated. "You understood what I needed in there," he said quietly. "You offered exactly the perspective that shifted their calculation." "I understood that a child shouldn't be sacrificed to adult politics," Isabel replied. But as they drove through the city's darkness, she recognized that something fundamental had shifted in how the council perceived her. She was no longer simply the human woman who'd found an injured shifter child. She was someone with clarity they recognized and respected. She was becoming something neither fully human nor shifter, but existing in the space between, essential in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. Chapter 7. 90 Days of Becoming. The community that Marcus delivered Julian to existed on the periphery of shifter civilization, a township nestled in the mountains where the primary conflict wasn't with external threats, but with the internal fractures that came when power consolidated without consideration for those it governed. The population numbered roughly 60 shifters, all capable of transformation, all bound together by proximity and mutual recognition of shared shifter nature. But unity, as Marcus explained to Julian during their approach, had fractured roughly 3 months earlier when the sitting Alpha had began redistributing resources in ways that favored certain family units over others. Julian arrived with minimal fanfare, introduced simply as a young shifter requiring integration into community life. Marcus remained present for the first week, establishing Julian's legitimacy while maintaining careful distance that suggested the boy was here to learn, not to lead. The transformation was deliberate. Julian wasn't positioned as authority figure but as observer and participant, allowed to witness the deterioration that came when governance abandoned equity in favor of expediency. The community's economic structure was relatively simple. Hunting territories provided primary sustenance. Agricultural cooperatives managed cultivation of crops. A central council was supposed to distribute resources according to need, but the current Alpha had begun favoring his own family unit, creating resentment that festered through social structures and ultimately manifested as outright division. Families were splitting their hunting practices to avoid shared territory. Farmers were hoarding crops. The foundation of communal trust was collapsing beneath the weight of perceived injustice. Julian moved through this fractured landscape with a maturity that transcended his 12 years of age. He spent his first 2 weeks simply listening. He ate meals with different family units. He learned the history of each faction's grievance. He absorbed context that most adolescents would have found incomprehensible. But Julian had been raised in devastation. He understood displacement and trauma, and the particular way communities fragmented when survival became individual, rather than collective. The Alpha doesn't see it as injustice, an older female shifter named Sylvia explained during one of Julian's listening sessions. She was a woman in her 50s, her wolf form impressive in its power, her human perspective sharpened by decades of managing family dynamics across transformation boundaries. He sees it as reward for loyalty. His interpretation is that those who follow his directives receive benefit. Those who resist receive nothing. It's a hierarchy, he would argue. Power structures are natural to shifter society. But it breaks the community, Julian responded, his observation simple but carrying weight that suggested deeper understanding. You're not functioning as unified territory anymore. You're fragmenting into competing groups. Yes, Sylvia agreed. Which is why we're dying. Population was 80 shifters 2 years ago. We're now 60. Families left to seek territory with better governance. Young people transformed and left to join other communities. We're in collapse. By day 15, Julian had formulated a proposal. He approached Sylvia first, understanding that authority in fractured communities often operated through recognition networks rather than formal hierarchies. His suggestion was radical for shifter culture, a redistribution mechanism that would balance resources more equitably, coupled with a council structure that would represent all significant family units, rather than operating as dictatorial authority. The alpha will refuse, Sylvia said, not unkindly. He benefits from current structure. Then the council will need to suggest it from unified position, Julian replied. If multiple families move together, his refusal becomes obstruction rather than governance. What followed across the next 3 weeks was something between education and subtle revolution. Julian moved through the community with careful intention, proposing his vision not as demand, but as collaborative possibility. He positioned himself as translator between factions, someone who understood both the alpha's perspective and the concerns of families experiencing resource scarcity. He offered to facilitate conversations that had become impossible through other channels. Then, on day 40, everything shifted toward confrontation. The first phase of Corvus's sabotage arrived with precision that suggested careful coordination. Funds designated for community infrastructure, a grain storage facility that was desperately needed for winter preparation, disappeared during transfer. The theft amounted to roughly 30% of the community's available resources, a loss that would create genuine suffering during the harsh months approaching. Julian's response was immediate and calculated. Instead of attempting to hide the theft or minimize its impact, he convened the entire community and presented detailed accounting of what had been stolen and by whom. The revelation served multiple purposes simultaneously. It demonstrated that theft had occurred through external actors, not through internal malfeasance. It united the community against a common threat, rather than dividing them through mutual suspicion, and it created opportunity for Julian to propose immediate collective response. Families contributing personal resources to compensate for the stolen funds, creating shared investment in recovery. We can choose to let this fracture us further, Julian explained to the assembled community, his young voice carrying conviction that seemed impossible for a 12-year-old. Or we can recognize that external forces are trying to destabilize us precisely because we're beginning to unite. The theft isn't about acquiring resources. It's about preventing us from rebuilding collective strength. The community's response was remarkable. Instead of descending into blame, families began volunteering their own surplus for communal storage. Hunters organized additional expeditions to replenish stocks. Farmers accelerated harvest timelines. The attempted sabotage transformed into catalyst for genuine solidarity. The second phase of Corvus's assault arrived roughly 2 weeks later and took the form of deliberate disinformation. Rumors spread through the community claiming that Julian was merely a spy sent by the Alpha King to consolidate control over the territory. The narrative suggested that Julian's proposals for redistribution were actually mechanisms for centralizing power, that the supposedly stolen funds had been moved at Julian's direction, that the young shifter was manipulating emotions to establish dominance. This attack was more subtle and therefore more dangerous. Unlike physical theft, rumors operated through social fabric and created psychological erosion that could undermine trust in ways that resources couldn't repair. Some families began questioning Julian's motives. The unity that had briefly emerged through collective response to theft started fragmenting again. Julian's response came not through words, but through action. He began spending extended time with families experiencing resource scarcity. He participated in hunts, demonstrating genuine commitment to community survival rather than personal advancement. He worked on the grain storage facility reconstruction, laboring alongside those who'd been most skeptical of his presence. He made decisions in each interaction that consistently prioritized community welfare over personal benefit. By day 70, the rumors had become untenable. The community recognized through observable behavior that Julian's commitment was genuine. His actions contradicted the narrative of self-interested manipulation. Trust slowly began rebuilding. But Corvus had escalated to his final gambit. The third phase arrived with direct intimidation. Agents arrived in the community claiming authority to investigate potential fraud. They threatened families that had been most enthusiastically supporting Julian's proposals with investigation and possible exile if they continued resisting proper hierarchical authority. The intimidation was designed to create fear sufficiently profound to override the tentative unity that had been carefully constructed across the previous weeks. Julian faced a moment that would determine the trajectory of everything that followed. He could retreat from visibility, protecting himself while allowing the community to fracture under pressure, or he could risk himself in defense of people who'd granted him trust, despite lacking biological connection. He chose confrontation. When the intimidation agents attempted to isolate several key community members, Julian positioned himself between the agents and those families. His young form transformed into wolf state, his body placing physical blockade between threat and those seeking protection. But more significantly, the community transformed alongside him. Shifters who'd learned vulnerability alongside Julian during the previous weeks stepped forward in coordinated defense, their wolves creating barrier that no external force could breach without explicit acceptance of conflict. The intimidation agents retreated. But before departing, they transmitted information to whatever authority had sent them. The community couldn't be fractured through external pressure because its foundation had transformed into something resistant to division. Over the remaining days of the 90-day period, the community underwent genuine restructuring. A council was established representing all significant family units. A redistribution mechanism was implemented that balanced resources according to need, while still rewarding effort and contribution. Young people who'd planned departure began reconsidering, recognizing that the community was becoming something worth remaining within. The population that had declined to 60 was beginning incremental growth as scattered families heard rumors of transformed governance and chose to return. On the week after the 90th day, Julian stood before the Alpha Council in the capital city, surrounded by community representatives who'd traveled to provide testimony. The evidence of his accomplishment was physically present, not in dramatic statistics, but in the obvious unity of people who'd been fractured weeks earlier and had chosen collective restoration. Ryder watched his son from the council chamber's peripheral position, and something fundamental shifted in how the Alpha King regarded the young shifter who bore his blood. This wasn't a traumatized child requiring protection. This was an emerging leader demonstrating capacities that transcended age and experience. The father recognized in his son something that would eventually become worthy of the authority that Ryder himself wielded. But more importantly, during those 90 days of separation, something had healed between them through mental channels that only shifters could access. The guilt that Ryder had carried about his son's trauma began transforming into recognition of resilience. The fear that Julian was too damaged to become what he was meant to be dissolved beneath evidence of genuine competence. Julian returned from his trial transformed in ways that transcended mere survival. He'd become something other than traumatized adolescent. He'd become heir in substance as well as genetics, proven capable of leadership that emerged from compassion rather than dominance, from understanding rather than force. The challenge to Ryder's authority was extinguished, not through violent confrontation, but through demonstration that the Alpha King's blood produced successors worthy of the responsibility such inheritance demanded. Chapter 8. New Foundations. The ceremonial chambers where Corvus faced judgment existed in a space older than most human nations. Ancient stone carved with symbols that predated written language held the weight of shifter law and tradition that had accumulated across millennia. Corvus entered with the confidence of a predator who believed his strength would transcend political consequence. He exited 3 hours later, marked for exile, his pack redistributed among alphas loyal to Ryder, his authority stripped with the finality of judicial pronouncement that would echo through shifter territories for generations. Ryder did not personally execute the dueling challenge, though many expected he would. Instead, he appointed Marcus as his champion, understanding that visible restraint was more powerful than demonstrated rage. When Marcus dispatched Corvus's physical threat with brutal efficiency, the council recognized something significant. The Alpha King was secure enough to not require personal vindication. That security translated directly into political ascendance. Those alphas who'd been uncertain of Ryder's position suddenly became vocally supportive. The narrative shifted from contested authority to demonstrated supremacy. Within days of Corvus's defeat, the council convened to formally recognize Julian as legitimate heir. The boy stood in chambers designed for centuries of hierarchical posturing, his small frame somehow carrying the authority that Ryder's bloodline had granted him. When the ancient words of recognition were spoken, the entire assembled council bowed, not to the child, but to the future they were acknowledging. Julian Thorne, born of human and shifter union, raised outside shifter culture, had become the undisputed successor to the Alpha King's dominion. Isabel experienced the recognition through observation from the chamber's periphery, where she stood beside Marcus. She watched Ryder's expression shift from controlled Alpha King to something more raw, a father witnessing his son's legitimacy, acknowledged by the entire political structure that had previously questioned it. The transformation happened subtly, visible only to those who understood the complexity of what Ryder carried internally. That evening, Ryder brought her to the council chamber's private antechamber. The formality of his bearing suggested something significant was about to shift between them again. "I want to propose mating," he said without preamble, "in formal declaration before the council, in ritual that will bind you to me through both human and shifter law. I want the entire political structure recognizing that you are not merely companion, but mate, meaning equal authority, meaning protected status that supersedes all other claims." Isabel's response was simultaneously immediate and complicated. She loved this man, had recognized that love somewhere between protecting his wounded son and standing before judges who questioned her very presence. But acknowledging love and accepting a formal bonding in a world she still partially understood were different propositions. "What does mating mean?" she asked. "Practically, I mean. Beyond the ceremony. It means permanent claim," Ryder answered. "It means if I die, my authority partially transfers to you. It means anyone who threatens you is threatening Alpha King lineage. It means legal recognition across the entire shifter territories that you are mine in the way I am yours. It's marriage translated through supernatural framework." "And if I say no?" Isabel asked, not from doubt, but from needing to understand that refusal remained possible. "Then I accept that refusal," Ryder said, though the weight of what he was surrendering became visible in his features. "You are not bound to me. You can choose any path that appeals to you, but I'm asking you to choose this one, to choose me, to choose Julian, to choose the life we've been building since you found an injured child in your barn." Isabel kissed him instead of responding with words, understanding that some answers transcended language. The mating ceremony occurred 3 days later, in a space that existed at the intersection of human and shifter worlds. The ritual combined elements of human marriage with shifter tradition, vows spoken in English that carried legal weight in human courts, followed by the exchange of scent marking that bound them at biological level. When the ceremony concluded, Isabel Hartford had become Isabel Thorne, mate of the Alpha King, stepmother to the heir, woman who'd transcended her species to occupy territory that had previously seemed impossible to inhabit. The reception that followed was attended by alphas from across the territory. Politicians who'd previously questioned Isabel's legitimacy now offered formal greeting. The woman who'd been a human farmer weeks earlier was suddenly recognized as diplomatic asset, her relationship to Ryder suggesting an unprecedented bridge between human and shifter worlds. Isabel navigated these interactions with surprising grace, understanding that her presence served multiple political purposes while also simply being genuine celebration of commitment made. But the most significant moment came when Marcus brought Grace Emerson into a private chamber where Ryder, Isabel, and Julian awaited. Grace had aged a decade in the month since Julian's disappearance. Her face carried the particular exhaustion of someone who'd carried fear as primary emotion for extended period. When she saw her son alive and whole, the transformation in her expression was absolute. She moved toward Julian with the desperate need of a mother who'd believed she might never hold her child again. "Julian," now possessing greater maturity and understanding than the traumatized boy Grace remembered, approached her with careful intention. He understood, on some level that transcended 12-year-old comprehension, that his mother had protected him through 12 years of fear, had kept him safe through the only means available to her. "You did the right thing," Julian said to her, his words carrying forgiveness that should have been impossible for someone his age to offer. "You kept me safe. You kept me human. When everything changed, you did everything you could." Grace wept, the kind of release that comes when burden finally becomes shareable. Ryder, observing from deliberate distance, recognized this moment as genuine healing, not of the dramatic kind that storytelling typically demanded, but the quiet kind that happened when families found ways toward authenticity, despite the impossible circumstances that had tested them. When Isabel contacted Thomas through careful phone channels, her father's voice came through with the particular emotion of a man who'd believed he might never hear his daughter's voice again. "I'm safe," Isabel assured him. "I'm happy. I know that probably doesn't make sense given everything, but I am. I'm with people who value me. I've built something that feels like purpose." Thomas listened to his daughter's voice and understood that the life he'd attempted to preserve through control had needed to shatter to give her authentic existence. He offered his blessing with the grace of a man who'd learned that love sometimes meant releasing those you cherished. "If you ever need anything," Thomas said, "if circumstances ever make it possible, you can return. This is still your home." "I know," Isabel replied. "That's what makes everything else possible." The days accumulated into weeks into months. 180 days following Julian's official recognition, the household that had formed existed in quiet sanctuary. Julian moved through shifter-specific education under Ryder's guidance while simultaneously integrating into human cultural studies that Isabel provided. Grace, finally freed from the burden of isolation and fear, began exploring the shifter world she'd always understood intellectually, but never experienced directly. She moved into the apartment alongside them, becoming not replacement for Isabel, but supplement to the family that was genuinely forming. One evening, as autumn was transitioning toward winter, the four of them occupied the living space they'd collectively claimed. Julian studied historical texts of shifter civilization, his young face concentrated with effort. Isabel prepared a meal that bridged human and shifter culinary traditions, something she'd begun creating to honor the merged existence they inhabited. Ryder worked on documentation related to his position as Alpha King, the administrative reality of governing territories that transcended conventional geography. Grace sat by the window with a book on shifter history, finally allowing herself the luxury of learning about the world she'd always partially inhabited. It was ordinary. It was domestic. It was everything that none of them had believed possible months earlier. Isabel looked around this space, at the man she'd chosen to bind herself to permanently, at the child she'd protected through his transformation, at the woman who'd sacrificed her entire life for her son's safety, and recognized that the isolation of her father's farm had been necessary only to prepare her for this possibility. She'd needed to understand loneliness to recognize connection when it appeared. She'd needed to experience suffocation to appreciate freedom when it arrived. The future stretched before them with uncertainty, but that uncertainty no longer carried terror. It carried potential. Corvus's faction would eventually reorganize. New challenges would emerge. But the foundation they'd constructed together, built on sacrifice and honesty, and the willingness to transcend species boundaries, was solid enough to withstand whatever complications awaited them. Julian looked up from his text and made eye contact with Ryder across the space between them. The communication that passed was the wordless dialogue of shifters, the mental acknowledgement that moved beyond human language. Father recognized son's transformation, not from trauma into survivor, but from victim into heir, capable of leadership, born from genuine compassion. Isabel squeezed Ryder's hand as she moved past him toward the dining area, where she was arranging prepared food. He pulled her close, marking her neck with the scent gland gesture that affirmed their bonding in the way shifter tradition required. The action was both intimate and public, a statement that in this moment, before this family unit, the Alpha King was simply a man committed to the woman who'd transformed his world. Grace watched them with eyes that had finally learned to recognize love as possibility rather than threat. The evening settled around them, holding this moment in temporal suspension, the space between surviving and thriving, between isolation and belonging, between the person each of them had been, and the possibility of who they might yet become. Outside, the city moved forward with its ordinary human concerns. Inside, a family that shouldn't have existed by any conventional measure had found ways toward authentic connection. The supernatural world that had initially seemed threatening to Isabel was now simply the landscape of her daily existence. The human world that Ryder had long transcended had been reintroduced through Isabel's persistent humanity. In this space, they were finally home.